Was Elizabeth II a great queen? That is the question I will attempt to answer. So the queen just recently died on September 8th at the age of 96 years old. She reigned for 70 years and 7 months. She was the longest reigning monarch in British history. I would say, overall, most people loved and admired the queen and were deeply upset when she passed. I know a lot of people, even Christian conservatives, they've praised the queen for being such a remarkable woman and a remarkable ruler and symbol of Christian Western values. Now, I have no doubt the queen was a remarkable woman, but where I draw the line at is remarkable ruler. I personally do not believe the queen was a great monarch, nor good at ruling, and I'm going to explain why here in just a second. So first off, if we just take a look at her 70-year reign, the queen was the head of state of Great Britain and the Commonwealth nations, most notably Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So let me ask you all a question. Have these nations gotten better or worse these past 70 years? Have these nations become more Christian or less Christian these past 70 years? One could argue that those nations have gotten better technologically and economically, but one cannot argue that those nations have gotten better morally. There's absolutely no way. I know a lot of Christian conservative people who have been praising the queen for her remarkable rule, but was it really that remarkable? That's the question, was it? Under her reign, all throughout the Commonwealth, every principle she was supposed to symbolize and embody has been deserted by the culture and even by the government she, quote unquote, rules over. These principles being just basic Western values, Christian values and principles, which is the value of human life inside and outside the womb. The sanctity of marriage between one man and one woman, freedom of speech, freedom to defend yourself, freedom to move freely without having a jab inside of you, freedom in a lot of areas. And lastly, but not least, faith itself, faith in the Christian God, the one true God, Jesus Christ. All of these principles stem, obviously, from Christian morality. And another principle, she's supposed to uphold it is justice. Justice is the principle the monarch is supposed to embody. Even today in the English courts, justice is carried out and law and order is maintained in the name of the sovereign. But the question is, has justice been carried out in the Queen's name? Truly, has it? Abortion has been legalized under her reign. Gay marriage has been legalized under her. The sexualization of children by the public school system, with this whole LGBTQ agenda being forced down these children's throats. This is all taking place under her rule. Freedom of speech squashed in this era of PC culture, this politically correct culture. There's no freedom of speech in the Commonwealth nations. There isn't. Doesn't exist anymore. And not to mention people's God-given rights and freedoms violated by these COVID tyrannical parliaments. You saw Canada, you saw with Trudeau, he used the military on his own people, my people, the Canadian people, who were freely and peacefully protesting the whole truckers convoy. Trudeau used force against them to silence them because he didn't like that they were opposing his tyrannical policies. You see in Australia with their quarantine camps. Hello, that's Nazi vibes right there. And then in New Zealand and the UK, they had their strict restrictions. So it's absolutely tyranny what these governments have done during COVID. And we cannot forget about this either. We cannot forget about this. We cannot forget about what these governments have done these past 2 years to so many people and just ruining so many people's lives. We've also seen, secularism and Islam, these two evil ideologies that, they have been slowly been supplanting Christianity, all in the name of tolerance. I mean, what good is a monarch who symbolizes a nation and its cultural values, only to have elected government officials, aka parliament, legislate morality that goes against the very values the monarch is supposed to represent? Not only that, unfortunately, you have the people, us citizens, who, as a majority, or at least half the population, unfortunately, they do not subscribe anymore to these Christian values the monarch is supposed to represent. But yet, we have paid her with our taxpayer dollars to represent those values anyway. I mean, if you truly think about this whole thing, it's so asinine, it's so stupid. Well, you might say, okay, Caleb, but what power did the queen really have? Like, wasn't she just a symbolic figure? Wasn't she just, a figurehead, basically? And, the answer to that is no, she was not. The queen actually had, legally, lawfully, and constitutionally, at least on paper, a lot of power. First of all, the British monarch is the supreme commander-in-chief of all the militaries of the Commonwealth nations. All the militaries of the Commonwealth nations. She is the supreme commander. The monarch has what's called Prerogative Powers. These are ancient executive powers that are granted to the monarch. They are Prerogative Powers are executive powers that can be exercised by the queen or her representatives, including government ministers. They are distinct, as these powers are not given to the queen or by her ministers by legislation enacted by Parliament. Rather, they are historical powers whose content is determined by common law, rules developed by the courts. The function of prerogative powers is wide-ranging, yet many of these powers are legally uncertain, with many ancient powers unused in modern times. But nonetheless, she has these powers, and they are hers, and she can use them in times when they are needed. If we look into it, the British monarch has the power to declare war and peace with any nation. The British monarch has the power of royal assent, which is the executive authority to execute bills that are passed by Parliament into law. Without the monarch's signature, a bill cannot be made law. The monarch has the power to veto, reject bills. The monarch has the power to remove prime ministers. In fact, she actually fired an Australian prime minister back in 1975. And lastly, the monarch has the power to dissolve Parliament. So yes, the Commonwealth monarch has a lot of power. Now, obviously, these powers are not something the monarch can use on a whim whenever the monarch wants to. These powers are reserved only for the monarch in times of crises. Well, has there been times of crises for the queen to have used them? I think absolutely. I mean, I just named the major ones earlier. The legislation allowing the murder of babies, abortion, legislation that redefined marriage, gay marriage, legislation that restricted speech, freedom of speech, and, legislation and mandates allowing corrupt, tyrannical prime ministers in the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand to lock down their nations and to mandate unlawful COVID restrictions and to violate their people's God-given rights and freedoms. These cases alone were enough for the queen to take action, to use her prerogative, her reserve powers. And not to mention, the English monarch is the supreme governor and defender of the church and the Christian faith. But has the queen defended the Christian faith these past, 30 years? She's allowed mass migration into her realms of people, aka Muslims, who do not even share Western values. Values, again, she is supposed to represent and embody and uphold. She's even allowed Muslims to be mayors and government officials in in her country. You know, our ancestors, I truly believe our ancestors, and especially the queens, are probably rolling in their graves right now, knowing that all this stuff is happening and the nations they, fought for and fought for this freedom and fought against people who are against these freedoms that we take for granted. So what does action look like practically, you might ask? Well, I think it looks like the Queen simply vetoing bills that are immoral and removing government officials from Parliament who propose such bills. People who promote evil are just as bad as people who perpetrate evil, as well as removing and arresting tyrannical prime ministers like Justin Trudeau, who violated people's God-given rights and freedoms. She would do this by writing executive orders and having the police, and if need be, the military enforce those orders. This is how governments work, people. This is not extreme. Whether you're an elected official or a monarch, the police/military are to enforce the laws, righteous laws, of course. And it just so happens that it is the monarch, not Parliament, who has the allegiance of the army. So she could have done this. Now, people will say that's political suicide. Well, guess what? Someone has to do it. Someone's got to do it. You know, that she may have gotten blasted by the media, Hollywood, corrupt, cowardice politicians, but if the Queen would have done the things I just listed, she would have had the law on her side, and most importantly, she would have had God on her side, because it would have been the right and moral thing to do. And to the people who say that it is political suicide and that's not practical, well, my answer to them is, what's the alternative? Do we just continue to allow wicked politicians to remove the Christian foundation upon which the West was built on? Do we just allow them to continue replacing the moral framework that stabilizes our society with practices such as child sacrifice and sexual perversion of every sort? I mean, come on. Do we just sit back and let this happen? Government using force against evil only sounds extreme because we as a society have been conditioned to think that. The devil doesn't want a righteous government to use the sword against evil, because then he can't get away with all sorts of evil like he has been getting away with. And have you ever wondered why the British monarch does not have absolute power anymore? Have you ever wondered why the royal family has been reduced to icons and figureheads? I can't get into all the history, but to summarize it, the common people back in the day, they were tired of evil kings and nobles with absolute power ruling over their lives. So the common people formed an army. They created an alternative government, a righteous government, to combat an evil government. And they physically removed, through war, the evil kings and dictators. This is how elected governments were formed. It was through war. It was through force. And now the elected governments have the force. They have the police and the military on their side, and because they're the government. They're the government officials, the elected government officials. So it's like, we can't just pretend that, if a monarch exercises power and uses, the military or whatever for means of righteousness, that's extreme, because you have elected governments who are using the means of force through police and the military to enforce wickedness and to enforce their immoral legislation. If you don't think democracies can be tyrannical, then you don't know history or the nature of humans. Even elected government officials can be tyrannical. Actually, I think tyrannical republics or parliamentary governments are worse than tyrannical monarchs, because instead of having one tyrant, you have multiple tyrants. And one could easily argue that removing one tyrant is much easier than removing multiple tyrants. But in reality, it doesn't really matter what government system you have. What matters is what kind of people or persons are in that government. I would much rather live under a righteous monarch who has absolute power than a democracy that is ruled by evil and wicked politicians who are legislating immorality left and right. And the whole reason why democracies were born were because kings were stealing the people's money and lands. They were perverting justice. They were selling out their country to foreign powers and even replacing the nation's religious values with other religions. But what happens when our elected government officials start stealing people's money and land and start perverting justice and sell out the country to foreign powers and replace the nation's religious values? That's exactly what's happening right now in our democracies with our elected government officials. You know, Parliament was supposed to be a check and balance to the crown. So I believe the crown is and should be the check and balance to Parliament. You can have both, and they can work. I actually love the idea of a constitutional monarchy, which I will get into later, but we can't have this thinking that only monarchies are tyrannical, because that's not true. We're seeing more tyranny with elected government officials than we have with King George III in England back in the day. I mean, if the founding fathers knew what elected officials in the West were doing to their nation, they would have went to war 100 times over by now, because what some of these elected government officials have been doing is so much more tyrannical than what King George III was doing back in the 1700s. You know, he raised taxes on the Americans, and they went to war over that. And, you know, there's some other things too, but the main thing was, you know, taxation without representation. Now, can you imagine if the founding fathers knew what elected government officials were legislating nowadays? Oh my goodness, they would have went to war if government officials legislated gay marriage, or if government officials legislated abortion, or if government officials, you know, started taking away their guns and started taking away their right to travel and without getting a jab and things like that. They would have went to war 100 times over. And the taxations that Americans have now, like that the government has done, like, oh my goodness, they would have went to war over so many issues that are normal to us nowadays. You know, we cannot let this misleading notion of progress pervert justice and pervert what is right. So the role of government is very simple. Proverbs 29:4, the king gives stability to the land by justice. Isaiah 32:1, behold, a king will reign in righteousness, and princes will rule in justice. Now, what is righteousness, you might ask? Well, righteousness is the quality of being morally right or acting in accord with divine or moral law, free from guilt or sin. So whose divine or moral law are we talking about? Well, obviously, God's moral law. Which God? Oh, the Christian God, the God of the Bible, Jesus Christ, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So it is I believe it is government's job to uphold biblical Christian morality. All laws are based on morality. So, you know, if we're a Christian nation, we got to base our laws on Christian morality, Christian principles, Christian laws. Now let me back this idea up in the New Testament, Romans 13:3-4. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. So the role of government, including the monarch, because the monarch is the supreme government official, is to uphold Christian morality, righteousness, to execute justice by punishing the evildoer with the sword. And first, you need to have a moral framework in order to execute justice. That's why I said uphold righteousness first, uphold morality first. It is also the job of the government to maintain law and order, to protect the people's divine rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and to defend the pillars that make up a Christian nation, which is the family unit, marriage between a man and a woman, because that's the definition of marriage. The church, again, the morality, the moral compass of a society, I believe, is the church. And to uphold a righteous government. Righteous government officials also need to defend government itself from evil people coming into government and perverting government. Just like the church needs to defend wolves in sheepskin. They would, if a pastor came into a church and started preaching heresy, the church congregants should kick that pastor out. And the leaders of the church should kick that pastor out. If a family, if someone came into a family, someone's family home, like an intruder or someone, trying to cause harm or disruption, the family, the father at least, for sure, the husband, needs to kick that guy out or kick that person out. And the wife needs to help the husband if necessary. And the kids, if they're old enough, needs to help as well to get that guy out of their home. It's the same thing with government. Righteous government officials need to kick out immoral, wicked government officials. It's that simple. Government is a structure, just like the churches and just like the family unit is a structure. They're the three pillars of a Christian society, of a Christian nation. When the government does this, when the government does its job, you see in Proverbs 21:15, when justice is done, it brings joy to the righteous, but terror to evildoers. Proverbs 29:2, when the godly are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked are in power, they groan. What have we been doing these past, few years? We've been groaning, especially when Justin Trudeau's been in for Canadians. Canadians have been groaning because they know that this man is a wicked ruler. Even Canadians who aren't Christians, they've been groaning. Inflation, higher taxation, the price of gas, the price of groceries, all these things make people groan if they're not affordable. Same in America. Look, the people have been groaning in America because of Joe Biden's rule and his reign. But when government fails to do its job, Ecclesiastes 8:11, because the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. We have seen this. There has been so much injustice going on by the courts, by politicians, that people are getting bold with doing evil because they're like, well, you know what? I'm not going to have a harsh sentence. I'm not going to get a harsh punishment. So yeah, I'm going to do it. I'm going to get away with it. So yeah, I'm going to rape this person. I'm going to murder this person, or whatever it may be. I'm going to steal this or that. Look at the BLM riots. I mean, people were fearless because in a lot of Democratic-run cities, they didn't squash these riots right away, and police didn't do their job, and so people were fearless, and they did all sorts of crimes and evil that some will probably forever get away with until they die, and then God punishes them for it. Isaiah 10:1, woe to those who enact evil statutes, and to those who constantly record unjust decisions. This is for the judges. Woe to those judges who enact evil laws. That is why we are seeing lawlessness increase all throughout the West. Lawlessness is the fruit of moral anarchy and consistent injustice. So the government has the authority to use the sword against the evil doer for good. All throughout the Bible, the king and justice were intertwined. You could not separate the two. The king was the executor of justice and the one who upholds law and order. And by upholding righteousness as well. Now let me be clear, just in case I I haven't been. I am not advocating for an absolute monarchy where the king or queen has absolute power. Absolutely not. I'm not advocating for that type of government. I actually love the system of a constitutional monarchy. I think it's a great form of government, in some ways better than a republic, and in other ways not. But I just love the idea of a righteous, God-fearing king who executes justice and who embodies the nation's cultural and religious values and morality and identity. I think it's special and patriotic, and quite frankly, I just think it's cool, to be honest. And if we just look at the Coronation Oath, the monarch solemnly vows, this is the British Coronation Oath, the monarch solemnly vows to govern the British people according to the laws passed in Parliament, to enforce law and justice, and to do everything possible to preserve the Anglican Church and the Protestant religion. Evil government officials have no problem using their power and authority for evil and against righteousness. I mean, if you look at what Joe Biden did and the DOJ to Donald Trump, they raided his home, for Pete's sake. That's using force against a righteous man. And again, if you look at all the elected government officials who have been using their power for evil, I brought up Justin Trudeau and the Freedom Convoy, the trucker convoy. Australia forcing people to go into quarantine camps. This is evil stuff. If evil rulers have no problem legislating evil and using the sword against righteous people, how much more should righteous people legislate righteousness and use the sword against evil people? Evil should fear righteousness, not the other way around. God has authorized the government to wield the sword against evil. That is the duty and responsibility of a righteous government. It's not only evil outside of government, but evil inside of government that a righteous government needs to fight against. We have no problem with the idea of righteous governments going to war against evil governments. If we look at World War II, for example, the Allies versus the Nazis. But righteous government officials should look to remove evil government officials who are in the same government as they are. It's like removing an arm that has like gangrene and is infected. You need to remove the arm or it will spread throughout the whole body and eventually kill the rest of the whole body. And another thing I heard people say that the Queen also represents was national unity, and that's fine. I agree with that to a degree. But the Bible teaches you cannot be united with evil. You cannot have national, like it all depends on the definition of what we're talking about. We need to come together and unite. Like, oh, you're pro-life, I'm pro-abortion, I'm pro-murder. Like, yeah, we just need to unite. It's just a difference of opinions. It's like, no, you're an evil person for wanting to kill babies. Like, I'm not gonna unite with you. You cannot tolerate evil, especially as a government official. You cannot be united with evil or tolerate evil. Psalm 1:1, how blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers. Psalm 94:20, can a throne of destruction be allied with you, one which devises mischief by decree? Now, obviously, David here is talking about God's throne, and God here, like, can a earthly throne of destruction or a spiritual throne of destruction be allied with God? And he's saying no. One, that throne that devises mischief by decree, by law, by legislation. And the answer is obviously no. And if we as Christians are supposed to be representatives of God, of Jesus Christ here on earth, in every sphere of influence, government included, then righteous leaders cannot be allied with destructive thrones, aka other government leaders who are devising mischief, who are legislating immorality. I hope that makes sense. I hope I explained that well. Like a throne, a destructive throne cannot be allied to a righteous throne, period. 2 Corinthians 6:14, do not be bound together with unbelievers, for what partnership have righteousness and lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? There is none. There is no bounding. There is no partnership with righteousness and wickedness and lawlessness. You just cannot do it. It does not work. Jesus hung out with sinners, but he didn't sin with them. He brought them to his level of righteousness. He didn't go down to their level of wickedness. And that's what we need to get right. So ultimately, I did not like how the queen did not use her power and authority against evil and against wicked politicians who have, quite frankly, destroyed the nation she embodies and who have disregarded Christian values and heritage she symbolizes. Also, on a side note, this is a whole other topic, a whole other podcast I'm going to be doing, but I do not think the queen was a good ruler because she was a woman, and I do not believe women are meant to rule. This is not my opinion. This is God's opinion. It's clear in Scripture that men are to lead and have authority and to rule in the home, in the church, and in government, in every major sphere of influence. I do believe a big reason why the queen was not a good ruler was because she was a woman, and it is not within women's nature to rule, to lead, to exercise authority, to have authority over men. And if Christians, get triggered by this, just remember, Deborah and Esther, these were exceptions, not the rule. And even Esther, she was a queen, but guess what? King Xerxes was above her. He was the top dog. He had the final say. He was the one who had supreme authority. And Deborah, well, the first thing she did was hire a man who was named Barak to lead the forces, to lead the army, to lead Israel. She never actually went to war or fought. So, and again, and even if they did lead, those are exceptions. They're not the rule. And I believe God will raise up a woman to lead and to rule if no righteous, courageous man is there to do so. The women are definitely not his first choice as rulers, as kings, as leaders, but God will use women if there are no men he can use. I believe that's clearly laid out in Scripture. And if Christians, again, are upset about that, well, let me basically challenge you on this. You Christian men, you Christian women, if you're upset of what I just said, well, how about you have the woman, your wife, you Christian men who might be upset about this, have your wife lead your home. Have your wife be the leader. You submit to your wife. You have your wife have the final say. Let your wife be the spiritual head of your home. Any Christian pastors who are upset with what I said, have women lead your church. Make women the primary leaders of your church. If you're okay with women, leading thousands and millions of men, leading nations, why aren't you okay with women leading, dozens of men in a church or one man in a home? I mean, this complementarianism position that the church has is hypocritical. It makes no sense, and it's against God's design. God does not want women to lead in civil government. Civil government affects and has more authority over the church and over the family. It affects the church and the family. It has the final say over the church and the family. So why would you have a woman lead in civil government, which is the most important sphere of influence to be in, but yet you won't have women lead in a church or in the home? You got to think about that. But anyways, I digress, and I go back to the main topic at hand. So if the monarchy is simply a figurehead who does not and is not supposed to exercise any power, then the monarchy, in my opinion, should be dissolved. It should die on a good note with the most beloved queen to ever sit on the throne, Queen Elizabeth II. The monarchy as simply a symbol or figurehead with no power is pointless, especially in our modern world. We We don't need idols and celebrities in government. We have Hollywood and athletes for that. It's a waste of taxpayer dollars. It costs millions of taxpayer dollars every year to maintain the monarchy, and they don't do anything but pretend to look moral. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's like the Pope. The Pope, in my opinion, is absolutely worthless and pointless. There's no need for his position. Jesus Christ is our mediator to God, not the Pope. So if I kind of compare that with the monarch, the British monarch, if the British monarch is supposed to just represent like a righteous king or a righteous government leader, we don't need to look to the Queen or King Charles III or the British monarch for that. We can look to Jesus for that. If the British monarch is supposed to just represent something and not have any power as a practical government official, then it's worthless, it's pointless. We don't need that. We can look to Jesus Christ through the scriptures of what a righteous leader looks like, just like we can look to Jesus Christ in the scriptures to be our mediator to God. We don't need to look to the Pope for that. We don't need that. So I hope that makes sense. I hope I'm explaining that well. It's just a waste of power and authority, really. And I'd rather have a morally corrupt celebrity who I don't have to pay taxpayer dollars to and who has zero power over my life than a morally sound monarch who I do have to pay taxes to, but who also has no power over my life, if that makes sense. I'd rather just have our head of state and head of government be the same person, like America's governmental system, in my opinion. And lastly, I'm going to close with this. Ecclesiastes 5:8. If you see in a province the oppression of the poor and the violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter, for the high official is watched by a higher authority, and there are yet higher ones over them. What does this mean? Well, it means the Most High God, who is infinitely above the greatest of men, is the supreme judge and king, who diligently observes and will eventually punish the wicked. I'm Caleb Vanka for Lions Awaken, and I hope you enjoyed this podcast.